It's a great honor to be on this panel. I'm sorry I was late to my other panelists. In the interest of time and hoping that there will be a discussion after, I'll try to keep my comments to 5 minutes. So I'll undershoot in the expectation that we can then have some debate and questions. I'm a historian by training. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not going to try to venture what's going to happen in Europe, but I'm going to try to tell you a story of a continent where, in spite of my very Italian name, I come from, Latin America. The experience of the populism that you think is very new in Europe, we've lived in Latin America for the last 17 years. Or 18 years. And what we know is what we have from history there, and I think that's quite valuable because very few people, I think, have really looked into the rise and the fall of those populists. So I'm going to try to venture to you an argument of a book I'm writing on the history of the period in the region. And so the argument is that, and it goes back to a different route of populism than the one that has just been discussed, because I think that there is, in this gap of representation, a moment in which certain societies, low-intensity democracies, where people do not feel engaged, educated enough to be part of the political dialogue, there is a break. And in those breaks, the populists rise. I think it's quite dangerous to blame the stupidity, with all due respect, of the electorate on their rise, because that's self-serving. And it's easy to say in this context, but it's hard to say when we don't beat them in elections. So what does it say about us, that we call them stupid, and then we lose to them in elections? And in fact, what happened in Latin America, I think, was not just the story of a commodity boom that had to be redistributed better. And therefore, the populists won, first in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez in 1999. The Chavistas are still in power, in case you haven't seen the chaos of Caracas. Then in 2002, Lula won in Brazil. Then in 2003, Kirchner won in my country, Argentina, and proceeded to stay in power until his death in 2010 and his wife until 2015. Then you had Evo Morales in Bolivia, Correa in Ecuador, both of which are still in power. And you had over a decade of almost every country in Latin America, with the exceptions of Chile and Colombia, which we can discuss later, where the populists were in charge. So what happened there? What happened there is that you had low-intensity democracies with very low levels of engagement of the citizenry, low levels of education for the general population, and extreme austerity imposed from above on the people of the continent. If it rings familiar, let's discuss it later. What happened, and the first crack of Chavez is very important, because the philosophers that Movimento 5 Stelle in Italy or Podemos in Spain admire are the very same ones that Chavez used to read. I recommend highly Ernesto Laclau's The Populist Reason, which is a book published quite a while ago, but believe it or not, the philosopher that wrote it died during a weekend when he was in an outing with Podemos representatives where he was lecturing about populism. He was Chavez's and Kirchner's favorite philosopher. His argument was simple. Why do they attack the institutions of the Republic? They do so not because they hate the Republic, but rather because they believe that the republics have been built by the elites and the elites have co-opted their methods. So the republics only are there to represent the special interests of the elites. So in a post-Marxist world, Laclau posits, if you have lost the chance of a real revolution from below, then your only shot is to do whatever it takes to destroy the institutions that oppress your people. It's rational. If the republic isn't going to represent everybody, let's destroy the republic and build it anew. So anything goes. If the judiciary stands in the way, get out of the judiciary. If the legislative tries to stop you, change the rules. And that is very interesting, because that's exactly what Chavez did in Venezuela. That is what Kirchner did in Argentina. What Evo Morales and Correa, the reason why they're still in power is because they changed their constitutions to stay in power. And let's leave aside the chaos of Brazil under Lula, where actually the institutions were strong enough to withstand. So many of the things that we see in this country, where the Prime Minister tries to change the media laws to be able to give his friends access to media licenses, or the way that Podemos planned to insert certain changes in the Spanish Constitution and deal with the crisis, reminds me of this. Not to mention, as Professor Monti could describe at length, many of the things that Movimento 5 Stelle would like to do to the Italian Republic. And so that's their rise. Their rise is very fast because they answer to an economic crisis where a lot of people were challenged. And I'll say 1 minute about their fall, and I'm over. The interesting thing about Latin America is that they did not lose in elections because, whenever there were elections, because of an economic crisis. They lost because of corruption. Because they presented themselves as something new, something different, something against the neoliberal elites that had imposed from above very difficult spending cuts on the poorest of society. But in the end, they were revealed to be worse than them. So Kirchner lost in 2015 because of the corruption scandals involving her family, Aníbal Fernández, the candidate of governor for the province of Buenos Aires, and a lot of other people. The Chavistas are losing popularity because they're revealed to be drug dealers that smuggle the oil to Colombia and then sell it in the international market. And last but not least, in Brazil, the Lava Jato scandal, which has done away with the Partido dos Trabalhadores from power and led to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, was launched because of an anti-corruption probe. And the only place where we have seen this level of intense, or at least historically where I've seen this level of destruction of a political elite, was the Italy of the early 1990s with Mani Pulite. Other than that, the Brazilian establishment has been completely destroyed by corruption. And that is what leads to the change. That's why you have Temer today, Macri in Argentina, and you have the prospect of a regime change. Well, you had it in Peru already, a prospect of a regime change in Bolivia and Ecuador. So hopefully this adds a different layer and a potential historical understanding of another process that is very similar, at the very least, to the populists of the left in Europe. Thank you.